She thought it was her last breath, but when Marshal Jedediah Stone found her broken body in the snow, she whispered words that would bind their fates forever. "I'll repay you." In the unforgiving wilderness of 1870s Montana, where Apache blood meant a death sentence and trust was rarer than gold, two souls scarred by violence must choose between survival and something far more dangerous: hope. Stay with me until the end of this tale and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels across our vast land. The wind cut through Marshal Jedediah Stone like a cavalry saber, slicing clean to the bone as he urged his mare forward through the gathering blizzard. Each gust carried the promise of death, the kind that came slow and white, burying a man's mistakes along with his bones. Behind him, the lights of Solitude Creek had long since vanished into the swirling void, leaving only the crunch of snow beneath hooves and the wheeze of his horse's labored breathing. Jed pulled his coat tighter, feeling the familiar weight of the Colt at his hip. 23 years of living, 8 of them wearing a badge, and he'd learned that Montana territory showed mercy to no one. Not to the hopeful settlers who'd frozen in their wagons last winter, not to the cavalry boys who'd never made it home from the Little Bighorn, and sure as hell not to a half-drunk marshal riding patrol in weather that would make the devil himself think twice. But duty was duty, even when it felt like punishment. The storm had blown in from the north that morning, carrying the scent of early death. November in Montana territory was God's way of reminding folks who really ran things, and this particular November seemed intent on making its point with extra vigor. The territorial governor had sent word down from Helena, increased patrols along the reservation borders. Too many reports of unrest among the Apache bands that had been relocated to the area. Too many settlers claiming to see smoke signals in the distance. Too many ranchers finding their cattle scattered or missing. Jed spat into the wind, watching the spittle freeze before it hit the ground. He'd seen enough of war to know what unrest really meant. It meant hungry people doing desperate things. It meant mothers watching their children grow thin while the Indian agency's promised supplies rotted in some warehouse in Helena. It meant proud warriors reduced to begging for scraps from the same government that had driven them from their ancestral lands. Not that anyone in Solitude Creek wanted to hear that particular truth. The town had been built on lies as much as timber and hope. Lies about the silver deposits that were supposed to make everyone rich. Lies about the railroad spur that was coming next year, or the year after, or maybe the year after that. And the biggest lie of all, that they could carve out their piece of paradise and never have to answer for what they'd taken. Jed's horse stumbled and he felt the animal's exhaustion through the saddle. The mare was a good one, a bay with heart enough for 3 horses, but even she had limits. They'd been riding for 4 hours, covering the northern boundary of his patrol area, and found nothing but wind and snow and the kind of silence that made a man's thoughts turn dark. "Easy, girl," he murmured, patting the horse's neck with a gloved hand. "We'll head back soon. Just need to check Widow's Hollow, then we can both get out of this hell." The horse's ears flicked forward, and Jed felt, rather than heard, her response, a subtle tension that meant she'd noticed something he hadn't. He reined her to a stop, squinting through the snow. Visibility was down to maybe 20 yards, now the world reduced to a gray-white cocoon that muffled sound and played tricks with distance, their movement, or maybe just a trick of the light. Jed drew his rifle from its scabbard, the metal so cold it burned through his gloves. "What is it, girl? You see something." The horse snorted, vapor streaming from her nostrils like dragon's breath. She took a step forward, then another, picking her way carefully through the deepening drifts. Jed let her have her head, trusting the animal's instincts over his own half-frozen senses. That's when he saw it. At first, it looked like nothing more than a dark bundle of rags caught against a fallen log. The kind of debris that storms sometimes carried for miles before depositing it in unexpected places. But as they drew closer, Jed's stomach clenched with a familiar dread. The bundle was the wrong shape, too organic, too Jesus Christ. It was a person, a woman from the looks of her lying face down in the snow, with her arms splayed out like she'd been running when she fell. Dark hair spilled across white ground like spilled ink, and her clothes, what was left of them, were torn and blood-stained. Jed was out of the saddle before he'd consciously decided to dismount his boots, crunching through the crust as he approached the still form. His rifle stayed ready in his hands because in Montana territory, even mercy could be a trap. She was young, maybe 18 or 19, with the high cheekbones and copper skin that marked her as Apache. Blood had frozen in dark trails down her face, and her breathing, if she was breathing at all, came in shallow, barely visible puffs. Her dress, once probably blue calico, was shredded across the back, revealing wounds that made Jed's jaw clench. Whip marks. Fresh ones. "Ma'am." He knelt beside her, keeping his voice low and steady. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No response. Her skin had the waxy pallor of severe cold exposure, and when he touched her neck to check for a pulse, her flesh felt like ice. But there, faint and irregular, but there the flutter of life stubbornly refusing to quit. Jed looked around, scanning the snow for tracks for any sign of how she'd gotten here. The storm had already begun to fill in whatever trail she might have left, but he could make out the shallow depression where she'd crawled the last few yards before collapsing. She'd been moving toward Solitude Creek, toward the very town that would likely string her up just for being Apache. Smart girl, he thought grimly, running toward the people who'd probably put those marks on her back. The wind picked up, driving snow horizontally across the hollow. In another hour, maybe less, this place would be completely buried. If he left her here, she'd be dead before morning. Hell, she might be dead anyway, but if he took her back to town— "Damn," he muttered, making his choice the way he always did, quickly and without looking back. He slung his rifle across his back and carefully turned her over. She was lighter than he'd expected, probably hadn't been eating regularly. Her face was a map of suffering, split lip, bruised cheek, a cut across her forehead that had bled freely before the cold stopped it. But underneath the damage, she was beautiful in the way that mountain streams were beautiful, all clean lines and natural grace. Her eyes fluttered open as he lifted her, dark as coffee and filled with the kind of fear that came from knowing exactly how much the world wanted you dead. "Easy," Jed said, the same tone he'd use with a spooked horse. "I'm not going to hurt you." She tried to speak, her lips moving soundlessly, then so quietly he almost missed it over the wind. "Please." "I've got you," he said, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. "You're safe now." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Nothing about this situation was safe, but sometimes a lie was all the hope a person could carry. Getting her onto the horse took some doing. She was conscious enough to help a little, but her body was rigid with cold and pain. Jed ended up lifting her sideways across the saddle, then climbing up behind her to keep her from falling. It wasn't dignified, but dignity was a luxury neither of them could afford. The ride back to his cabin seemed to take forever. The storm was worsening, and twice Jed lost the trail, entirely having to trust the mare's memory of home. The woman girl really drifted in and out of consciousness against his chest, sometimes mumbling words in Apache that he didn't understand, sometimes just shivering so hard he could feel it through both their coats. His cabin sat in a clearing about 2 miles east of Solitude Creek, far enough from town to avoid most visitors, but close enough to answer a call for help. It wasn't much: one room, a stone fireplace, and a lean-to stable for the horse, but it was solid and warm, and most importantly, his own. Jed half carried, half dragged the woman inside, kicking the door shut behind them with his boot. The cabin was dark and cold, the fire having died to embers while he was out on patrol. He settled her on his cot, then quickly set about building up the fire, feeding it kindling and logs until it roared back to life. In the growing firelight, he got his first good look at what he'd brought home. She was worse than he'd thought. The whip marks on her back were deep, some still seeping blood through the torn fabric of her dress. Her hands were scraped raw, probably from trying to break her fall or crawl for help. And her feet, Jesus, her feet were bare and cut to pieces. She'd been running through rough country for miles. Jed heated water and gathered what medical supplies he had: some whiskey for cleaning wounds, strips of clean cloth for bandages, and a bottle of laudanum left over from when a horse had kicked him last spring. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "This is going to hurt," he warned her, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. Cleaning the whip marks was ugly work. Each touch of the whiskey-soaked cloth made her arch and gasp, even unconscious. But infection would kill her just as surely as the cold. So Jed gritted his teeth and did what needed doing. When he was finished, her back looked like a patchwork of white bandages and angry red flesh. Her feet were almost as bad. Whatever shoes she'd been wearing were long gone, and the soles were a mess of cuts and punctures. Some of the wounds had gravel embedded in them, which Jed picked out with the tip of his knife while trying not to think about how much it must hurt. By the time he finished, dawn was creeping through the single window, and the storm had blown itself out into an exhausted silence. The woman slept deeply now, her breathing more regular, some color returning to her cheeks. She was going to live, probably. The question was, what happened next? Jed made coffee and sat in his single chair watching her sleep and trying to figure out what the hell he was going to do. In the cold light of morning, the magnitude of his situation was becoming clear. He had an Apache woman in his cabin, beaten half to death, and probably fleeing from something even worse. If anyone in Solitude Creek found out, well, that would be the end of his career as a marshal, and possibly the end of a lot more than that. The town had been on edge ever since the Apache bands had been moved to the reservation. There'd been talk in the saloons about the need for firm measures and showing them who's boss. Last month, a rancher named Hiram Caldwell had come into town claiming Apache raiders had stolen his cattle, though Jed had found the cows wandering loose 2 valleys over with their brand marks clearly visible. But facts didn't matter much when folks were scared and angry, and an Apache woman alone and vulnerable would be seen as either a threat or an opportunity for revenge. Maybe both. She stirred on the cot, and Jed set down his coffee. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking in the firelight as she tried to orient herself. When she saw him sitting there, she went very still, like a deer that had just caught scent of a wolf. "Easy," Jed said again, keeping his voice low. "You're safe. You're in my cabin about 2 miles from Solitude Creek. I found you in the snow yesterday evening." She didn't respond, just watched him with those dark eyes that seemed to take in everything: the layout of the room, the location of the door, the rifle leaning against the wall. Smart girl, always thinking about escape routes. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nothing. Mine's Jedediah Stone. Jed, I'm the marshal for this territory." He gestured to the badge on his shirt. "I'm not going to hurt you." Still nothing, but he saw her eyes flick to the badge and then back to his face. Recognition there, and not the good kind. She knew what that piece of tin represented, knew that it marked him as an agent of the people who'd driven her tribe from their lands. Jed tried again. "You were hurt pretty bad. Someone took a whip to you. Do you remember what happened?" This time something flickered across her face. Pain maybe, or anger. Her hand moved instinctively to her back, then stopped as if she'd remembered where she was. "I cleaned the wounds and bandaged them," Jed said. "You should heal up fine, but you need to rest and keep them clean." She struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her injuries. Jed started to rise to help her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Message received, don't touch me." When she was upright, she looked around the cabin again, this time more carefully, taking inventory. Her gaze lingered on the door, measuring the distance, calculating odds. "You're wondering if you can make it to the door before I stop you," Jed said. "Answer is probably not in your condition, but you don't need to run. I meant what I said, you're safe here." She spoke for the first time, then her voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "No, Apache safe with white lawman." Her English was accented but clear, educated probably at one of the mission schools. That explained the dress she'd been trying to fit into the white world, and it had nearly gotten her killed. "Maybe not," Jed admitted, "but you're safer here than out in the snow. and a hell of a lot safer than in town. Town wants me dead. It wasn't a question, and Jed didn't insult her intelligence by denying it. Some of them might, but they'd have to come through me first. She studied his face, looking for the lie. Why you help Apache woman? Jed considered the question. It was a fair one. Why was he risking his job, his reputation, maybe his life for a stranger? Because she was hurt, because it was the right thing to do, because he'd seen enough death and cruelty for one lifetime, because, he said finally, somebody should. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the world was white and still, as if the storm had washed it clean. But Jed knew the peace wouldn't last. It never did. "What's your name?" he asked again. This time, after a long moment, she answered Nia. It was a start. Over the next few hours, Jed managed to piece together fragments of her story. She'd been living on the reservation with her grandmother, the last of their immediate family. Her parents had died in the wars, her brothers scattered to other territories or killed fighting the cavalry. She'd been trying to make a life for herself the white way, learning English, wearing their clothes, even attending the mission church on Sundays. But the reservation was a hard place and getting harder. The promised supplies often failed to arrive or came spoiled and rotten. The Indian agent, a man named Cornelius Marsh, was more interested in lining his own pockets than fulfilling treaty obligations. And when people got desperate, when children went hungry, and elders died of diseases that proper medicine could have cured, some of the younger men started talking about the old ways, about taking what they needed instead of waiting for promises that never came. "Agent Marsh, he say we steal cattle," Nia said, accepting a cup of coffee from Jed, with hands that only trembled slightly. "Say we break treaty, make trouble for white settlers." "Did you?" Jed asked. Her eyes flashed. "We take nothing. We have no food, but we take nothing, grandmother. She say we must keep peace, must follow white man's law, even when white man break his promises." "But Marsh didn't believe you. Marsh, he want to make example, show other Apache what happen when they cause trouble." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He have me brought to his office. Say I know where stolen cattle are. Say I tell him or—" She didn't need to finish. Jed had seen enough frontier justice to fill in the blanks. Marsh had probably started with threats, then moved on to more persuasive methods when she couldn't or wouldn't tell him what he wanted to hear. "How did you get away?" "Grandmother, she come to office, make big noise. Say she tell territorial governor about Agent Marsh if he hurt me more. While they argue, I run." "And you've been running ever since?" Nia nodded. 3 days, no food, no water after first day. Then storm come, and I think maybe better to die in snow than let them catch me. The quiet admission hit Jed harder than he'd expected. This girl, this woman, had been prepared to freeze to death rather than face whatever waited for her back at the agency. What kind of world had they built out here where that seemed like the better choice? "Your grandmother," he said, "is she—" "Safe, I think. They not hurt old woman too many people watch. But me—" Nia shrugged a gesture that spoke volumes about the value of one Apache girl's life in the white man's world. The afternoon passed quietly. Nia slept most of the time, her body fighting to heal itself. Jed kept the fire burning and tried to think through his options. He could take her back to the reservation, but that would be delivering her straight into Marsh's hands. He could try to get word to the territorial governor, but that would take weeks, and bureaucrats in Helena weren't known for their sympathy toward Indian troubles. Or he could do nothing, keep her here until she was healed, then help her disappear. Head south to Arizona territory or west to California. Somewhere she could start over away from Cornelius Marsh and his ideas about making examples. The problem was supplies. His cabin was stocked for one person through the winter, not two. And a marshal going missing for days at a time would raise questions he couldn't answer. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snowfields orange and red, Jed made his decision. Tomorrow he'd ride into Solitude Creek and gather what they'd need for a longer stay. Food, medicine, maybe some women's clothing if he could manage it without raising suspicions. It would be risky, but less risky than the alternatives. Jed, Naya's voice was stronger now, though still quiet. Yeah. Why you really helped me truth this time. He looked at her across the firelight, this broken girl who'd survived things that would have killed weaker people. She deserved honesty, even if it wasn't flattering. I spent 4 years in the war, he said. Saw a lot of good people die for bad reasons. Saw a lot of bad things done in the name of good causes. When it was over, I came out here thinking maybe I could make a difference. Be one of the good ones, you know. And now I think maybe the best I can do is help one person at a time, starting with you. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, at mission school, they teach us about white man's God. Say he love all his children red and white same, but when I see how white men treat my people, I think maybe their God only love white children. Maybe, Jed said, or maybe the problem isn't with God, but with the people who claim to speak for him. You believe in white man's God. I believe in doing what's right even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. If that makes me religious, then I guess I am. Nia smiled for the first time since he'd found her, just a small curve of her lips, but it transformed her face. Grandmother, she say, spirits watch over people who show kindness to strangers. Maybe your God and our spirits, they not so different. Maybe not. That night, Jed gave her the cot and made himself a bed on the floor near the fire. He lay awake, listening to her breathing, thinking about the conversation they'd had. She was right about one thing: most of the white settlers out here wouldn't see any difference between Apache spirits and Christian devils. Religion was just another weapon in the war between the races, another way to justify taking what they wanted and calling it righteous. But maybe sometimes faith was simpler than that. Maybe it was just choosing to believe that people could be better than their worst impulses, that mercy was possible even in the hardest places. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and sending snow devils dancing across the clearing. Winter was coming in earnest now, and with it, the kind of isolation that either brought people together or drove them apart. Jed found himself hoping for the former, even as he prepared for the latter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices. But tonight, in the warmth of the fire and the simple act of sheltering someone who needed it, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. The first pale light of dawn was creeping through the frost-covered window when Jed heard Naya stirring on the cot. He'd been awake for the better part of an hour, stoking the fire and brewing coffee, his mind already turning over the day's necessities. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence, but with it came the harsh reality of their situation. Morning, he said quietly, not turning from the stove where bacon sizzled in the cast-iron pan. How are you feeling? Nia pushed herself up, carefully testing the pull of her bandaged wounds. Better, stronger. Her voice carried more conviction than it had the night before, and when Jed glanced over his shoulder, he saw color had returned to her cheeks. Good. You'll need your strength. He divided the bacon between 2 plates, adding hardtack and the last of his preserved peaches. It wasn't much of a breakfast, but it was what they had. I need to ride into town today. We're running low on supplies. She accepted the plate with a nod of thanks, but he caught the flicker of fear in her eyes. You tell them about me? No. The word came out harder than he'd intended. And I won't. But people are going to wonder where I've been, why I'm buying extra food. I'll need to be careful. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Outside, the world lay pristine and deceptive under its blanket of snow, beautiful enough to make a man forget how quickly it could kill. How long you been marshal here? Naya asked, setting down her empty plate. 3 years come spring. Took the job after the last marshal got himself shot trying to break up a claim dispute. Jed poured himself more coffee, offering the pot to her. Seemed like good work for a man trying to stay out of trouble. And now you got a Apache woman in your cabin. That trouble or not trouble? Despite everything, Jed found himself almost smiling. Well, when you put it like that, I bring danger to you. Maybe I should go. Go where? The question hung in the air between them. They both knew the answer. There was nowhere for her to go, not in winter, not with Marsh's people probably still looking for her. Besides, I knew what I was doing when I brought you here. Did you? She studied his face with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much. Or you just good man who cannot leave hurt person to die? Maybe both. Nia was quiet for a moment, considering. Grandmother, she always say good hearts make trouble for their owners. Maybe she right. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. Wise enough to survive when others did not. Wise enough to know when to bend and when to stand firm. Nia's voice carried a note of sadness. I hope I have her wisdom when I need it. An hour later, Jed was saddling his horse in the lean-to stable, checking his gear and running through his mental list of supplies. The mare seemed eager to get moving, probably tired of being cooped up during the storm. He couldn't blame her. You be careful, Nia said from the doorway. She'd wrapped herself in one of his heavy coats, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips. Town people, they watch everything. They remember everything. I know. He secured his rifle in its scabbard and swung into the saddle. Keep the fire going and stay inside. If anyone comes. He hesitated, then drew his spare pistol from his saddlebags and handed it to her. You know how to use one of these. She took the weapon with familiar ease, checking the cylinder and testing the action. Father teach me when I was small, before the soldiers came. Good, I'll be back before dark. The ride into Solitude Creek took longer than usual, the horse picking her way carefully through the snow-covered trail. Jed used the time to prepare his story, running through the details until they felt natural. He'd been checking the northern boundaries when the storm hit, had to hole up in an old line shack until it passed. Simple, believable, the kind of thing that happened to every lawman in winter country. Solitude Creek looked like a Christmas card under its coating of fresh snow, all clean lines and picturesque rooftops. The illusion lasted until Jed reached Main Street and saw the reality beneath the pretty surface. The town was struggling, had been struggling since the silver deposits proved less rich than promised. Half the storefronts stood empty, their windows dark and papered with notices of bankruptcy sales. The people who remained had the hard, suspicious look of folks watching their dreams crumble one piece at a time. Jed tied his horse outside Garrett's general store and pushed through the door, setting the bell above it, jangling. The warmth inside was a welcome relief, scented with coffee and leather and the indefinable smell of human commerce. Marshal Stone. Henry Garrett looked up from his ledger, his round face brightening. Wondered where you'd gotten to. Figured the storm might have caught you out. Had to ride it out in Murphy's old line shack up north, Jed said, stamping snow off his boots. Thought I was going to freeze to death before it let up. Nasty blow, that one. Lost 2 head of cattle myself, found them froze solid this morning. Garrett shook his head mournfully. What can I do for you? Jed handed over his list, watching the storekeeper's face as he read it. Garrett's eyebrows climbed higher with each item. This is quite a bit of supplies, Marshal. You planning to spend the winter in that cabin of yours? Storm reminded me how fast things can go bad out here. Rather have too much than too little. Jed kept his voice casual, but he could feel sweat gathering under his collar despite the cold. Besides, my pay's good for it. Oh, sure, no question about that. Garrett began gathering items from his shelves. Just seems like a lot for one man is all. Well, you know how it is. Bachelor cooking. Jed forced a laugh. Half of what I make ends up burned anyway. As Garrett worked, other customers drifted in and out of the store. Jed recognized most of them. Mrs. Patterson buying fabric for her seamstress business. Old Pete Williams picking up tobacco and newspapers. Sarah McKenna shopping for her family's ranch. Normal people living normal lives, most of them decent enough in their own way. But when Hiram Caldwell pushed through the door, the atmosphere in the store shifted like a weather change. Caldwell was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with hands that looked like they could break bones without much effort. He'd come to Montana Territory 5 years ago with money from somewhere back east, and the kind of certainty that money often brought. His spread was one of the largest in the area, and he had opinions about everything from cattle breeding to territorial politics. Marshal Caldwell nodded curtly, his pale eyes taking in the supplies Garrett was packing. Heard you were missing during the storm. Some folks were getting worried. Just doing my job, Hiram, checking the boundaries like always. Find anything interesting up north? There was something in Caldwell's tone that made Jed's instincts prick up. Any sign of our Apache friends? Nothing but snow and wind. Jed kept his voice level. Why you missing more cattle? Caldwell's face darkened. As a matter of fact, I am. Found signs this morning that someone's been around my herd. Tracks in the snow, fresh ones. Could be anyone. Drifters, rustlers from over the mountain. Could be, Caldwell agreed, but we both know who it's most likely to be. Those reservation savages getting bold again. The other customers in the store had gone quiet, listening to the exchange with the careful attention people pay to potential trouble. Jed felt their eyes on him, weighing his response. I'll ride out and take a look, he said finally, but let's not jump to conclusions. Storm like that, lots of animals get scattered. Scattered hell. Someone cut my fence line and drove off 20 head. That's not weather, Marshal. That's theft. Garrett finished packing Jed's supplies, clearly eager to avoid getting dragged into the conversation. That'll be $12.40, Marshal. Jed paid and shouldered the heavy pack, already planning his route back to the cabin. The sooner he got away from Caldwell's suspicious stare, the better. I'll come by your place tomorrow, he told the rancher. Take a proper look at those tracks. See that you do. Caldwell stepped aside to let him pass, but his voice followed Jed to the door. And Marshal, if you do find sign of Apache raiders, I hope you'll remember whose side you're supposed to be on. The words hit like a physical blow, but Jed kept walking. Behind him, he heard Caldwell begin holding court with the other customers, his voice rising as he painted pictures of savage threats and weak law enforcement. By evening, half the town would be convinced that Apache war parties were massing in the hills, preparing to sweep down and murder them all in their beds. The ride back to the cabin felt longer than the ride in, weighted down as it was with supplies and suspicion. Jed found himself checking his back trail more than once, though he saw no signs of pursuit. Still, Caldwell's parting words echoed in his mind. The rancher was influential in the community, the kind of man whose opinions carried weight with territorial officials. If he decided Jed was too soft on the Apache question. The cabin came into view just as the sun touched the western peaks, its single window glowing yellow with firelight. Smoke rose straight up from the chimney in the still air, and for a moment Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the simple pleasure of coming home to someone who was waiting for him. Naya met him at the door, relief evident in her face as she helped him with the heavy pack. You are safe. She stopped herself, but the unfinished words hung in the air between them. Worried, Jed finished. Yeah, me too. Town's all stirred up about missing cattle. Hiram Caldwell's pointing fingers at the reservation. They blame Apache for everything. Cattle die in storm, Apache steal them. Crops fail, Apache curse them. White baby cry at night, Apache spirits. Despite the seriousness of their situation, Jed found himself chuckling. You're probably not wrong about that last one. They unpacked the supplies together, Naya exclaiming softly over small luxuries like real coffee and canned peaches. Jed had managed to acquire a dress and some undergarments from Mrs. Patterson's shop, claiming they were for a cousin visiting from back east. The lie had felt clumsy on his tongue, but the seamstress had seemed to accept it. "You did well," Naya said, holding up the dress to examine the fit. "But people will talk about Marshall, who suddenly needs women's clothes. And let them talk. Small towns always need something to gossip about. And when they put gossip together with missing Apache woman, it was a fair question and one Jed had been wrestling with all day. We'll deal with that when it happens. For now, we focus on keeping you safe and getting you strong enough to travel when spring comes." "Spring is long way off." "I know." They prepared dinner together, working around each other in the small space, with an ease that surprised them both. Naya moved carefully, still favoring her injured back, but she was clearly feeling better. The hot food and warm shelter were working their healing magic. "Tell me about this Caldwell," she said, as they sat down to eat. "He is powerful man in your town, powerful enough, rich, connected, the kind of voice people listen to when times get hard." Jed cut his venison into small pieces, thinking, "He's not evil exactly, just convinced that the world works a certain way, and anyone who doesn't fit his vision is a problem to be solved. And Apache woman in Marshall's cabin, that is big problem for his vision. The biggest." After dinner, they sat by the fire, Naya working on mending her torn dress, while Jed cleaned his weapons. The domestic scene felt both natural and surreal. A wanted Apache woman and a territorial Marshal, sharing quiet conversation like any married couple settling in for the evening. "You have woman before?" Naya asked, suddenly not looking up from her sewing. The question caught Jed off guard. "What makes you ask that? You move around woman like you have practice, not awkward like man who live alone always." "There was someone, back in Kansas before the war." The memories were old and bittersweet, like photographs left too long in sunlight. "Her name was Elizabeth. We were going to be married when I got back." "But you did not go back." "No. The man who left for war and the one who came back, they weren't the same person. Elizabeth saw that right away. Smart woman knew it wouldn't work." Jed set down his rifle and reached for his pistol. "She married a shopkeeper named Davidson. They have 3 children now, from what I hear." "You sorry it did not work?" Jed considered the question. "Sorry for her, maybe. She deserved better than a broken-down soldier with too many ghosts, but not sorry for me. Some people aren't meant for that kind of happiness." "Why not?" "Because some things, once you've seen them, you can't unsee. Some things change you so deep that you can't pretend to be the person you were before." Naya was quiet for a long moment, her needle moving in steady rhythm through the fabric. "At mission school they tell us about white man's war, brother fighting brother. They say it was about keeping black people as slaves. That's what they say now. Seemed more complicated when I was living through it." "You fight to free slaves." "I fought because my state told me to fight, because my friends were fighting, because I was 18 years old and thought I knew what honor meant." Jed's voice carried the weight of old regrets. "Took me 4 years and too many dead friends to figure out that honor's a luxury poor men can't afford. But you still try to be honorable, man. You help me even when it bring trouble. Maybe that's different, personal choice instead of someone else's cause." "Maybe." Naya set down her sewing and looked at him across the firelight. "You asked me question yesterday about God and spirits. I think maybe honor is like that too. Same thing, different words." "Could be." The conversation drifted to other topics as the evening wore on. Nia told him about her childhood before the wars and the reservations when her people had followed the buffalo migrations and lived by the rhythm of the seasons. She painted pictures with her words of a world that seemed as distant as the moon, full of freedom and purpose and the kind of connection to the land that white settlers couldn't understand. "Sounds like paradise," Jed said. "Not paradise, hard life sometimes. People die from cold, from hunger, from sickness. But free life. Choose your own path, make your own mistakes." Her voice carried a deep sadness. "Now we live in white man's boxes, follow white man's rules, wait for white man's permission to live. I'm sorry. Sorry not enough. Sorry, just words white people say to make themselves feel better about what they take. The sharp truth of it stung, but Jed didn't argue. She was right, and they both knew it. Sorry was what people said when they couldn't or wouldn't make things right. What would be enough? He asked. Give back what you steal. Let my people go home. Naya shook her head. But that never happened. Too many white people now, too much money in keeping us where you put us. So what do you do? How do you live with that? Same way you live with your war ghosts. One day at a time. Try to find small pieces of good in the bad. Is that what this is? Jed gestured to the space between them. A small piece of good. Maybe. Or maybe just two broken people helping each other not feel so alone. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and sending snow swirling across the clearing. Winter was settling in for its long siege, and Jed found himself wondering what they would all look like when spring finally came. Would he still be Marshal of Solitude Creek? Would Nia still be alive? Would whatever fragile trust was growing between them survive the pressure of months in close quarters? Storm coming again, Nia observed. Good. Storms make people stay inside, keep to themselves. Less chance of unwelcome visitors. You think they will come looking? Eventually. When Caldwell can't find his missing cattle anywhere else, he'll start expanding his search. And when he does... Jed didn't finish the thought, but he could see in Naya's eyes that she understood. They both knew this peaceful interlude couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the outside world would force its way in, and when it did, they would have to make choices that would define the rest of their lives. But for now, in the warm circle of firelight with the storm building outside and the simple companionship of shared conversation they had this moment, it might be all they ever had, but it was enough. Get some rest, Jed said, finally banking the fire for the night. Tomorrow I need to ride out to Caldwell's place. Take a look at those tracks he's so worked up about. Be careful. Men like him, they see what they want to see. I know. And Jed, she waited until he looked at her. Thank you for everything. Thank you for trusting me. Not sure I have choice. Everyone has choices. You chose to live instead of dying in the snow. You chose to tell me your name instead of staying silent. You chose to stay instead of running. Jed settled down on his makeshift bed near the fire. Those were good choices. We see. Ask me again when spring comes. As Naya settled onto the cot and Jed arranged his blankets on the floor, the cabin grew quiet except for the whisper of wind and the settling of logs in the fireplace. But beneath the surface calm, both of them were thinking about tomorrow, about the tracks Caldwell claimed to have found, about the dangerous game they were playing in a world that offered no mercy to those who broke its unwritten rules. In the darkness, listening to Naya's breathing deepen into sleep, Jed found himself praying to whatever God might be listening that they would have enough time to figure out what came next. Because one thing was becoming increasingly clear: their small piece of sanctuary was balanced on a knife's edge, and it wouldn't take much to send it all tumbling into chaos. The fire settled with a shower of sparks, and outside the storm gathered strength for another long night's siege. The next morning brought a sky the color of old pewter and the kind of cold that made a man's breath freeze before it left his lungs. Jed woke before dawn, as was his habit, and lay still for a moment listening to the subtle sounds of the cabin settling around him. Naya's breathing was deep and even from the cot, and the fire had burned down to glowing embers that painted the walls in shifting shadows. He dressed quietly, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside to tend to his horse. The world was hushed under its blanket of snow, so quiet he could hear the distant crack of tree limbs contracting in the cold. His breath formed clouds that dissipated quickly in the still air, and the snow crunched under his feet with the particular sound that meant the temperature had dropped well below freezing during the night. When he came back inside, Nia was awake and sitting up on the cot, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She'd wrapped herself in one of his heavy blankets, and in the dim light she looked younger, somehow more vulnerable than the fierce survivor he'd been getting to know. Cold morning, she said quietly. Cold enough to freeze the devil's conscience. Jed stirred up the fire and added fresh wood. Going to be a hard ride out to Caldwell's place. You still going even with storm coming? Jed glanced toward the window where the gray light was barely penetrating the frost-covered glass. Have to. If I don't show up, he'll start asking questions I can't answer. Better to face his suspicions head-on than let them fester. Nia nodded, understanding the logic, even if she didn't like it. What you think you find there? Probably exactly what he wants me to find. Tracks that point toward the reservation, maybe some torn fabric caught on a fence post, something to confirm his theories. Jed filled the coffee pot and set it on the stove. Question is whether he planted the evidence himself or just convinced himself to see what wasn't there. And if you find nothing, then I tell him there's nothing to find, and he calls me a fool or worse. Either way, it buys us time. They shared a quiet breakfast of hardtack and coffee, neither saying much but both acutely aware that this was becoming a ritual between them, this careful sharing of small comforts in the face of an uncertain future. When Jed rose to gather his gear, Nia caught his arm. Be very careful today. Men like Caldwell, when they not get what they want, they get dangerous. I know. He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, surprised by the warmth of her touch through the fabric. You'll be all right here. I will stay inside, keep fire burning, watch for trouble. Same as yesterday. Good. He hesitated, then reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a small wrapped package. Almost forgot. Got you something in town. Nia unwrapped it carefully, her eyes widening when she saw what was inside. It was a book, leather-bound and well-worn, its pages yellowed with age. Poetry, she breathed, running her fingers over the cover. Longfellow. Figured you might want something to read during the long days. Mrs. Patterson at the store said it was popular with the ladies. I know this book. We read some at mission school. She opened it to a random page and read softly, By the shore of Gitch Gumi, by the shining big sea water, the song of Hiawatha. You don't have to like it, I just thought, I love it. The words came out more intense than she'd probably intended, and Jed saw color rise in her cheeks. Thank you. This is very thoughtful gift. Well, Jed found himself oddly pleased by her reaction. Seemed like the least I could do. An hour later, he was riding through the gray morning toward Caldwell's ranch, his breath and his horses forming twin streams of vapor in the frigid air. The trail was treacherous with ice and hidden rocks, forcing him to let the mare pick her way carefully through the worst patches. By the time he reached the boundaries of Caldwell's land, the sun had climbed above the mountains, though it provided no warmth, only a pale light that made the snowfields glitter like broken glass. Caldwell's ranch was an impressive spread testimony to the kind of success that came from having money to start with, and the ruthlessness to protect it. The main house was built of good timber and stone with a wide porch and glass windows that spoke of Eastern refinement transported to frontier realities. Outbuildings dotted the property, barns, bunkhouses, equipment sheds, all well-maintained and prosperous-looking. Jed found Caldwell near the corral, talking with two of his hired men. The rancher was bundled in a heavy coat and fur hat, but his face was red with cold and anger. When he saw Jed approaching, he broke off his conversation and strode over. About time, Marshal. Been waiting for you since sunup. Had to check a few things in town first, Jed lied smoothly. Show me these tracks you found. Caldwell led him to a section of fence line about a quarter-mile from the main buildings. The wire had been cut in two places, neat cuts that looked deliberate rather than accidental. In the snow around the break, Jed could see the trampled evidence of cattle being driven through the gap. 20 head, Caldwell said, his breath steaming. Prime beef cattle worth more than most men make in a year, driven off sometime during the storm when the snow would cover their trail. Jed knelt beside the tracks, studying them carefully. The prints were clear enough in the protected areas where wind hadn't filled them in cattle hooves, definitely, and what looked like horse tracks following behind. But something about the pattern bothered him. You follow the trail at all. Far as I could before it got too dangerous. Heads north toward reservation land, just like you'd expect. And your men, any of them, see anything unusual during the storm? Caldwell's jaw tightened. My men know their business, Marshal. They wouldn't steal from me. I'm not suggesting they would, just trying to understand the timeline. Jed stood and walked along the fence line, noting how the wire had been cut. Clean cuts made with proper tools, not the hasty work of desperate thieves. This took time. Whoever did it wasn't in a hurry. Indians have all the time in the world. It's not like they have jobs to worry about. The casual bigotry in Caldwell's voice made Jed's teeth clench, but he kept his expression neutral. Maybe. Or maybe someone wanted it to look like Indians did it. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing, just considering all possibilities. Jed remounted his horse, already planning his route back to the cabin. I'll ride north, see if I can pick up their trail, but with this weather, don't expect miracles. I expect you to do your job, Marshal, and if that means riding onto reservation land to get my cattle back, then that's what I expect you to do. I'll do what the law allows, Hiram. Nothing more, nothing less. Caldwell's pale eyes narrowed. The law allows for pursuit of stolen property, and it allows for citizens to protect themselves when the law fails them. The threat was clear enough, though Caldwell was smart enough not to state it directly. Jed touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that could have been respectful or mocking, depending on how you chose to interpret it. I'll be in touch when I know something. The ride north toward the reservation boundary took him through country that grew progressively wilder and more broken. Here the mountains pressed closer together, creating valleys and draws that could hide an army if necessary. The trail of the missing cattle was easy enough to follow at first, a trampled path through the snow that spoke of animals being driven at a steady pace. But as Jed followed the tracks deeper into the back country, something began to feel wrong. The cattle had been moving in too straight a line, too purposefully. Stolen livestock driven by nervous thieves should have shown more signs of confusion, more wandering as the rustlers tried to find the best route through unfamiliar terrain. This looked more like cattle being moved by someone who knew exactly where they were going. The trail led him to a hidden valley about 5 miles from Caldwell's fence line, a natural corral formed by steep rock walls and a narrow entrance that could be easily defended. And there, huddled together against the cold, were Caldwell's missing cattle. All 20 head, exactly as he'd claimed. But they weren't alone. 3 men sat around a small fire in the shelter of an overhanging rock, passing a bottle between them and talking in low voices. Jed recognized one of them immediately, Tom Bradley, one of Caldwell's own hired hands. The other 2 were strangers, rough-looking men with the kind of hard faces that came from living on the wrong side of the law. Jed backed his horse away from the valley rim, his mind racing. This wasn't Indian cattle rustling at all. This was something else entirely, and he was beginning to get an ugly picture of what that something might be. He made his way carefully back toward Caldwell's ranch, taking a different route to avoid being spotted. The pieces were falling into place now, forming a pattern that made his stomach churn with disgust. Caldwell hadn't lost his cattle to Apache raiders. He'd had them stolen by his own men, probably to create evidence for whatever plan he was hatching. The question was what that plan involved, and how it connected to the missing Apache woman everyone assumed was dead or long gone. When Jed reached Caldwell's ranch again, he found the man waiting for him on the front porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands and an expectant look on his face. "Well," Caldwell asked as Jed dismounted, "find anything? Trail goes cold about 3 miles north. Snow's too deep and the wind's blown away most of the sign." Jed kept his voice carefully neutral. "Could be anywhere by now. That's it. That's all you've got." "It's what the evidence gives me, Hiram. I'm a lawman, not a magician. Caldwell's face darkened. Maybe it's time for some citizens to take matters into their own hands. Can't rely on the law when the law won't do its job. The law's doing its job just fine. Sometimes that job is admitting when there's not enough evidence to act. Evidence. Caldwell spat into the snow. I'll tell you what's evidence, Marshal. Apache raiders stealing cattle just like they've been doing for months, and a territorial marshal who's too soft to do anything about it. Careful, Hiram. That's starting to sound like an accusation. Maybe it is. Caldwell stepped down from the porch, moving closer to Jed's horse. Maybe it's time someone asked why you're so reluctant to take action against these savages. Maybe it's time someone wondered what you do with all that time you spend riding patrol in empty country. The words hit like physical blows, and Jed felt his hand drift instinctively toward his gun. But showing violence now would only confirm Caldwell's suspicions, so he forced himself to remain calm. My job is to uphold the law, not to satisfy your prejudices. If you have a problem with how I do that job, take it up with the territorial governor. Maybe I will. Caldwell's smile was cold and ugly. Maybe I'll tell him how the Marshal of Solitude Creek seems more interested in protecting Indians than the white settlers who pay his salary. You do whatever you think is right, Hiram. Just remember that accusations work both ways. Jed turned his horse and rode away without looking back, but he could feel Caldwell's stare burning into his shoulder blades. The confrontation had gone about as badly as possible, confirming the rancher's suspicions while revealing nothing about his true plans. Whatever Caldwell was preparing, it was going to happen soon, and when it did, Jed and Nia would be caught right in the middle of it. The ride back to the cabin seemed to take forever, each mile weighted down with the knowledge of what was coming. By the time he reached the clearing, the gray sky had darkened to the color of charcoal, and the first flakes of new snow were beginning to fall. Nia met him at the door, taking one look at his face and immediately understanding that the news was bad. What happened? Jed told her everything as they sat by the fire, the cut fence, the missing cattle, the men he'd found in the hidden valley, and most importantly, Caldwell's thinly veiled threats. When he finished, Nia was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. So he steal his own cattle to make story about Apache raiders. That's what it looks like. Question is why. To make excuse for what he planned to do next. Nia's voice was flat matter-of-fact. He want to attack reservation, maybe kill some of my people, but he need reason white authorities will accept. And missing cattle gives him that reason. Missing cattle and missing Apache woman who everyone think is dead. Nia looked at him directly. If I suddenly appear alive, his story fall apart, so he need to make sure I never appear alive. The brutal logic of it settled over them like a shroud. Caldwell wasn't just planning to attack the reservation, he was planning to eliminate the one witness who could expose his deception. And Jed, by sheltering her, had made himself an accomplice in the rancher's eyes. How long you think we have? Nia asked. Not long. He's already suspicious, and he's got influence with enough people in town to make trouble for both of us. Jed poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. We need to think about getting you somewhere safe. Where reservation is first place he look. Town want me dead, and winter make travel almost impossible. There are other options. Trading posts, mining camps, places where people don't ask too many questions. In winter, in mountains, Nia shook her head. That just different way to die. They were trapped, and they both knew it. Winter had closed off most escape routes, and Caldwell's suspicions were narrowing their options with each passing day. Sooner or later he would force a confrontation, and when he did, their small sanctuary would become a battleground. There is other choice, Nia said quietly. What? I leave. Tonight before storm get bad. Try to reach my grandmother, warn her what is coming. You'll die out there. It's 20 miles to the reservation in good weather, and this isn't good weather. Maybe I die, but if I stay, you die too, and my people die not knowing what hit them. I won't let you go alone. Then you abandon your post, your duty. Caldwell use that against you, say you run away with Apache woman. Naya's voice was steady, but Jed could see the pain in her eyes. Either way, he win. There has to be another way. Maybe, but we not think of it yet. Outside, the wind was picking up again, driving the new snow horizontally across the clearing. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally arriving, and with it, another night of isolation that felt less like sanctuary and more like a trap. They prepared dinner in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The domestic routine that had become precious to them over the past few days now felt fragile, as if they were going through the motions of normalcy while the world prepared to tear them apart. "Read to me," Naya said suddenly as they finished eating, "from the book you give me." Jed looked surprised. "I'm not much of a reader aloud." "Please, I want to hear white man's poetry in white man's voice. Maybe help me understand how you see world." Naya handed him the Longfellow volume, and Jed opened it to a random page. The words felt clumsy on his tongue at first, but as he continued reading, he found a rhythm that matched the cadence of the wind outside. "Should you ask me whence these stories, whence these legends and traditions, with the odors of the forest, with the dew and damp of meadows?" "Stop," Nia said softly. "That part. Read it again." Jed repeated the lines, watching her face in the firelight. She was listening with the kind of attention people paid to sacred things, as if the words themselves held power. "He write about my people," she said when he finished. "But not really about us, about what white people think we are." "Is that bad?" "Not bad, just not true. Like looking at reflection in broken mirror. You see something that look familiar, but pieces missing, other pieces wrong." Naya was quiet for a moment. "But maybe that's how all stories work. We tell stories about who we want to be, not who we really are." "What story would you tell about your people, I mean?" "Story about people who love the land so much, they become part of it. Who know every tree, every stream, every animal like they know their own children. Who understand that taking only what you need is not weakness, but wisdom." Her voice carried a deep sadness. "But that story white people not want to hear. Easier to believe we are savage children who need to be civilized or removed. Some white people want to hear it. You think so? I know so because I'm hearing it now." They talked late into the night, sharing stories and perspectives with the kind of honesty that only came when people thought they might not have many more chances to speak. Nia told him about the old ways, the seasonal migrations, and spiritual ceremonies that had shaped her people's understanding of the world. Jed spoke about his childhood in Kansas, about the dreams he'd carried into the war, and the harsh lessons that had replaced them. "You ever think about what you do if you could start over?" Nia asked as the fire burned low. "Sometimes. Maybe find a piece of land somewhere quiet. Raise horses, live simple." Jed looked at her across the dying flames. "What about you?" "I think about place where Apache and white people live, like neighbors, not enemies. Where children learn from both traditions, take best from each." She smiled sadly. "Foolish dream, maybe. Maybe not. World's bigger than Montana territory. Maybe somewhere out there that kind of place exists. Or maybe we make such place ourselves." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and pain, because they both knew that whatever place they might imagine, whatever future they might dream, the morning would bring them back to the harsh reality of their situation. Outside, the storm was building to full fury, rattling the windows and sending snow devils dancing across the clearing. Inside, the fire settled into glowing coals, and two people who had found something precious in the midst of chaos prepared to face whatever tomorrow might bring. "Jed," Nia's voice was almost a whisper. "Yeah. Whatever happened next, I want you to know, these days here, they've been good days, worth whatever come after. For me too. Good. Then we not sorry for choices we make. No regrets, no regrets. As they settled in for what might be their last night of peace, neither spoke of the fear that was eating at them both. Fear that tomorrow would bring Caldwell and his men, that their small world of shared warmth and growing trust would be shattered by violence and hatred. Fear that they would be forced to choose between love and duty, between survival and sacrifice. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of the cabin, with the storm raging outside and the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, they had this moment. And sometimes in a world as hard and unforgiving as theirs, a moment was enough to make all the risks worthwhile. The wind howled like a living thing, and in its voice both of them heard the sound of change coming, whether they were ready for it or not. The storm raged for 3 days, turning the world outside the cabin into a howling white void that seemed to exist beyond the boundaries of time and space. Snow piled against the windows until only the top panes let in any light, creating a strange, muffled twilight that made it hard to tell morning from evening. The wind never stopped, a constant presence that rattled the walls and reminded them that nature still held dominion over human ambition. During those 3 days, Jed and Nia existed in a suspended reality cut off from the outside world and its demands. They rationed their firewood, carefully melted snow for water, and shared the diminishing supplies with the careful attention of people who understood that survival often came down to small margins. But beyond the practical necessities, something else was happening between them, something that neither had expected, and both were afraid to name. It started with small gestures. Nia mending a tear in Jed's shirt while he slept. Jed bringing her coffee before she asked for it the way he'd learned she liked it, strong and black with just a touch of sugar. They moved around each other in the confined space with an awareness that went beyond mere courtesy, an unconscious choreography of shared domestic life. On the second night of the storm, when the cold seeped through even the thick log walls and their breath-formed clouds in the firelight, they made a practical decision that felt like crossing an invisible line. The fire alone wasn't enough to keep them warm, and they had limited wood. Sharing body heat was simple survival sense. "Just for warmth," Nia said as they arranged the blankets, but her voice carried an uncertainty that matched Jed's own feelings. "Just for warmth," he agreed, though they both knew it was more complicated than that. She settled against his chest with careful dignity, maintaining what distance she could while still sharing the cocoon of their combined heat. Jed lay rigid at first, acutely aware of her presence, the whisper of her breathing, the way her hair smelled faintly of wood smoke, and something else that was uniquely her. But gradually, as the warmth built between them and exhaustion overtook anxiety, they both relaxed into the strange intimacy of survival. When Jed woke on the third morning, he found that sometime during the night Nia had turned in her sleep and now lay with her head on his shoulder, one hand resting lightly on his chest. She looked younger in sleep, the constant wariness that marked her waking hours replaced by something approaching peace. For a long moment he didn't move, afraid to disturb this fragile tableau, afraid to break whatever spell had made such closeness possible. But as consciousness returned fully, so did the weight of their situation. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to abate, the wind dropping from a howl to a moan. Soon, very soon, the outside world would return with all its complications and dangers. Nia stirred her eyes, opening slowly. When she realized how they were positioned, color rose in her cheeks, but she didn't pull away immediately. "Storm is ending," she said quietly. "Yeah, I can hear it in the wind. Soon people will be able to move again. Yeah." They lay there for another moment, both understanding what the storm's end meant, but reluctant to voice it. Finally, Nia sat up, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "We need to talk about what happened next." Jed nodded and rose to stoke the fire, giving them both a moment to collect themselves. When the flames were dancing high again, he turned to face her. "Caldwell will come. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when he does, he won't come alone. I know. Naya's voice was steady, but Jed could see the fear lurking behind her calm exterior. Question is what we do when he come. I've been thinking about that. There might be a way to turn this around, use his own plan against him. How? Jed settled beside her close enough to speak quietly, but far enough to maintain the careful distance they'd established. Those cattle I found in the hidden valley. His own men are guarding them, which means he's planning to discover them there and claim Apache raiders stole them. But what if someone else found them first? You mean you report them yourself? Not just report them, bring witnesses. Make it impossible for him to spin the story the way he wants. Naya considered this, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. But then he know that you suspect him, make you enemy instead of just inconvenience. I'm already his enemy. The question is whether I'm going to be a live enemy or a dead one. And me, what happened to me in this plan? Jed hesitated because this was the part that scared him most. You'd have to come with me into town. Let people see that you're alive and unharmed, that you've been staying with me voluntarily. You want to bring Apache woman into town full of people who want her dead. Naya's voice rose slightly. That not plan, Jed. That's suicide. Not if we do it right. Not if we control the narrative. Jed leaned forward, his voice urgent. Think about it. Caldwell's been telling people that Apache raiders are stealing cattle, terrorizing settlers. But if you appear alive and well cared for by the territorial marshal, it changes the whole story. Makes him look like a liar or a fool. Or make people think you've been helping Apache raiders all along. Maybe, but that's better than letting him set up an excuse to massacre your people. Naya was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. At mission school, they tell story about white man named Daniel. He thrown into den of lions for refusing to bow down to false gods, but God protect him and lions not hurt him. You think God will protect us? I think sometimes when all choices are bad, you choose the one that let you keep your honor. She looked at him directly. But I not ask you to risk your life for my people. You done enough already. It's not just about your people anymore. It's about us, about what we've become. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither had been willing to voice until now. Because somewhere in the shared warmth of the past 3 nights, somewhere in the quiet conversations and small kindnesses, they had become something more than marshal and refugee protector and protected. They had become partners in a way that went beyond survival. What we become? Nia asked softly. I don't know, but I know I'm not ready to let anyone take it away from us. She smiled, then the first full smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face completely. Grandmother always say love make people brave and stupid in equal measure. Love? The word came out rougher than he'd intended, and Nia's smile faded slightly. Sorry, I not mean to. That is, I know White Marshal cannot. No. Jed reached out and took her hand, surprising them both. Don't apologize. Don't take it back. But we both know it impossible. White man and Apache woman there, no place in world for such thing. Maybe not, but maybe that's what makes it worth fighting for. They sat holding hands in the firelight, 2 people who had found something precious in the most unlikely circumstances, both knowing that the world would do everything in its power to destroy what they had discovered. So we go into town, Nia said finally. Face the lions together. If you're willing. I willing, but first you need to know something. She squeezed his hand. Whatever happen, whatever people say or do, you are good man Jed Stone. Best man I ever know. You remember that when things get dark. I'll remember. You remember something too. You're stronger than any of them. Stronger than Caldwell. Stronger than their hatred. Stronger than their fear. They can only destroy us if we let them. The rest of the day passed in preparation. They cleaned their weapons, organized their supplies, and discussed the details of what they would face in town. The plan was simple enough in concept, but terrifying in execution. They would ride into Solitude Creek openly together and demand that the town council hear evidence about Caldwell's deception. It was a desperate gamble, but the alternatives were worse. As evening approached and the storm finally died to occasional gusts, they shared what might be their last meal alone together. The conversation was lighter than it had been in days, both of them determined to hold on to whatever happiness they could before facing whatever came next. "Tell me about Kansas," Nia said as they lingered over coffee. "What it like where you grow up? Flat. So flat you could see for miles in every direction, nothing but grass and sky. Summers that would bake the moisture right out of you, winters that made Montana territory seem warm." Jed smiled at the memory, but beautiful in its own way, especially in spring when the wildflowers came up and the whole prairie turned into a carpet of color. Sound peaceful? It was mostly. Good place to be a child anyway. Room to run, room to dream. His expression grew more serious. Of course, that was before the war came and changed everything. "You ever think about going back?" "Sometimes, but the boy who left Kansas died somewhere in Virginia, and the man who survived doesn't belong there anymore. Maybe he belong here, in Montana territory, with women who understand about losing homes." Jed looked at her across the table, memorizing every detail of her face in the lamplight. "Maybe he does." As they prepared for bed, their last night sharing the cabin's warmth, they moved with a new awareness of each other, a careful tenderness that acknowledged both their growing feelings and the uncertainty of their future. "Jed," Nia said as they settled under the blankets. "Yeah, whatever happened tomorrow, I want you to know, these been best days of my life. Worth everything that come before, worth everything that come after. Mine too." She turned toward him in the darkness, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then slowly, carefully, as if approaching something sacred, Jed reached out and touched her face. She leaned into his palm, her eyes closing. "I wish," he began. "I know, I wish too. But wishes were for people who had time and choices, and they had neither. So instead of speaking of impossible futures, they held each other through the night, taking what comfort they could from shared warmth and the simple fact of not being alone." Dawn came too soon, gray and cold and final. They rose in silence, moving through the familiar routine of morning preparations with the careful attention of people about to face a firing squad. Everything felt significant: the taste of coffee, the sound of the fire crackling, the way the light fell through the frost-covered windows. When they were ready to leave, they stood for a moment in the doorway, looking back at the small space that had become their sanctuary. "Strange," Nia said. 3 days ago, this feel like prison. Now feel like home. It'll still be here when we get back." "You think we get back?" "I have to believe that. Otherwise, what's the point of trying?" They saddled the horse together, Nia riding behind Jed as they had that first night. But now her arms around his waist felt different, protective rather than desperate, a gesture of partnership rather than mere survival. The ride into town took longer than usual, the horse picking her way carefully through the deep snow. They passed other travelers beginning to emerge after the storm, a farmer checking on his livestock, a family digging out their wagon, children building snowmen in their yards. Normal life resuming after nature's interruption, people who had no idea that their small world was about to be turned upside down. As they approached the outskirts of Solitude Creek, Jed felt Nia tense behind him. "Second thoughts?" he asked. "Many second thoughts, but first thought still strongest." "What's that?" "That some things worth dying for." The main street of Solitude Creek was bustling with activity as people emerged from 3 days of enforced isolation. Shopkeepers were shoveling snow from their doorways, ranchers were checking on supplies, and clusters of men stood talking on street corners, probably discussing storm damage and shared hardships. When Jed rode down the middle of the street with an Apache woman openly seated behind him, The bustling activity stopped as if someone had fired a gun in the air. Conversations died mid-sentence. People turned to stare, their faces cycling through surprise, confusion, and growing anger. By the time they reached the marshal's office, a crowd was beginning to gather, and Jed could hear the dangerous murmur of voices rising behind them. He helped Nia down from the horse, acutely aware of every eye watching their movements. She stood straight and proud despite the hostile stares, her chin lifted in defiance of their hatred. Marshal Stone, the voice belonged to Henry Garrett, the storekeeper, who was pushing through the crowd with his face flushed red. "What the hell is this? This is marshal business, Henry. I suggest you let me handle it." Marshal business. Hiram Caldwell's voice cut through the murmur like a blade. The rancher was striding down the street with several of his men behind him, his face a mask of cold fury. "Is that what you call harboring Apache criminals? I call it enforcing the law, something you might want to think about before you say anything else." Caldwell stopped a few feet away, his pale eyes taking in Nia with undisguised hatred. "This is the savage who's been raiding our cattle. I recognize her from the reservation." "No," Jed said calmly. "This is Nia, and she's been under my protection for the past week, recovering from injuries she sustained fleeing from Agent Marsh's illegal interrogation." "Lies," Caldwell spat. "You're protecting a murderer and a thief. The only thief I see here is you, Hiram. Should we talk about those cattle you've got hidden in the valley north of your place, the ones your own men are guarding?" The accusation hit Caldwell like a physical blow. His face went white, then red, and Jed saw his hand drift toward the gun at his hip. "Careful," Jed warned. "There are witnesses here. You sure you want to draw on a territorial marshal in front of half the town?" "You son of a bitch," Caldwell whispered. "You've been working with them all along. I've been doing my job, which apparently is more than I can say for you." The crowd was pressing closer now, and Jed could feel the mood turning uglier by the moment. These were good people mostly, but fear and prejudice could turn anyone into a mob. He needed to get control of the situation before it spiraled into violence. "I'm calling for a town meeting," he announced, his voice carrying over the murmur. "Tonight, 7 o'clock at the schoolhouse. Time everyone heard the truth about what's been happening around here." "The truth?" Caldwell laughed harshly. "The truth is you've been colluding with Apache raiders, and now you're trying to cover it up. Then come to the meeting and prove it. Bring your evidence and I'll bring mine. Let the people decide who's telling the truth." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people weighed the challenge. Jed could see uncertainty in their faces. They wanted to believe Caldwell, but the marshal's confidence was giving them pause. "This is ridiculous," Caldwell said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone. Then you won't mind if I bring a few witnesses to the meeting, including the men you've got guarding your stolen cattle." Caldwell's face went ashen, and Jed knew he'd scored a direct hit. The rancher was trapped now, unable to back down without losing face, but unable to move forward without exposing his deception. 7 o'clock, Jed repeated. "Everyone's invited." As the crowd began to disperse, people clustering in small groups to discuss what they'd witnessed, Jed guided Nia toward his office. He could feel the weight of their stares, the mixture of curiosity, hostility, and confusion that followed their every step. "Well," he said as they reached the relative safety of the marshal's office, "that went about as well as could be expected." "They want to kill me," Nia observed calmly. "Some of them do, but some of them are just scared and confused. Fear we can work with, hatred is harder. And Caldwell, what we do about him, we give him enough rope to hang himself. Tonight, in front of everyone, he'll have to either admit he's been lying or try to explain why his men are guarding cattle that were supposedly stolen by Apache raiders." Nia settled into the chair across from his desk, her dark eyes thoughtful. "And if he chooses to fight instead of explain, then we fight. But at least we'll be fighting in the open where everyone can see who draws first." The afternoon passed slowly, word of the evening meeting spreading through town like wildfire. Jed could see people gathering in small groups on street corners, their conversations intense and animated. Some looked angry, others curious, and a few seemed genuinely troubled by the conflicting stories they were hearing. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of orange and red, Jed and Nia prepared to face their moment of truth. They had gambled everything on this confrontation, betting their lives on the belief that most people, when faced with clear evidence, would choose justice over prejudice. It was a bet they would know the outcome of very soon. "Ready?" Jed asked as they prepared to leave for the schoolhouse. "No," Nia said honestly, "but ready or not, time to face the lions." They stepped out into the cold evening air, walking side by side toward whatever fate awaited them in the lamplight of the schoolhouse. Behind them, the marshal's office stood empty, and ahead the entire population of Solitude Creek was gathering to judge whether love could survive in a world built on hatred. The die was cast, and there was no turning back. The schoolhouse was packed beyond capacity, bodies pressed together in the stifling warmth of too many people breathing the same air. Oil lamps flickered from hooks along the walls, casting dancing shadows that made faces appear to shift and change like masks in a fever dream. Every seat was taken, and men stood 3 deep along the back wall, their voices creating a low rumble that reminded Jed of distant thunder. When he and Nia entered through the back door, the rumble died to absolute silence. Heads turned in unison, following their progress down the center aisle like spectators at an execution. Jed kept his hand resting lightly on his gun butt, not as a threat but as a reminder to everyone present that he was still the law in Solitude Creek, no matter what they might think of his choices. Nia walked beside him with her spine straight and her chin raised, meeting every hostile stare with calm dignity. She had braided her hair and wore the blue dress he'd bought her, looking for all the world like any other frontier woman except for the copper tone of her skin and the unmistakable pride that marked her as Apache. Some of the women in the crowd whispered behind their hands, their faces twisted with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. At the front of the room, someone had arranged a table and chairs to serve as a makeshift tribunal. Mayor Edmund Walsh sat in the center, his normally jovial face grave with the weight of the situation. To his left sat Reverend Matthews, the circuit preacher, whose fire and brimstone sermons had been drawing larger crowds since the Apache troubles began. To his right was Judge Harrison, visiting from the territorial capital, whose presence suggested that word of tonight's confrontation had reached official ears. Caldwell occupied a chair near the front, surrounded by his men and several other prominent ranchers. His face was a mask of controlled fury, but Jed could see the calculation behind his eyes. The man was still planning, still looking for angles to exploit. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Walsh began, his voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd, "we're here tonight to address serious allegations that have been brought to our attention. Marshal Stone has requested this meeting to present evidence regarding recent cattle thefts and other disturbances in our community." "Evidence?" Caldwell stood up, his voice cutting through the mayor's diplomatic preamble. "The only evidence we need is sitting right there." He pointed at Nia with a trembling finger. "An Apache savage in our very schoolhouse, protected by a marshal who's forgotten which side he's supposed to be on." A ripple of angry voices rose from the crowd, but Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Caldwell, you'll have your chance to speak. Marshal Stone, please present your case." Jed stepped forward, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, when everything would either come together or fall apart completely. 3 days ago, Mr. Caldwell reported that 20 head of his cattle had been stolen by Apache raiders. He showed me cut fence lines and tracks leading north toward the reservation. Jed's voice was steady, professional. I followed those tracks and found his cattle exactly where he said they would be, in a hidden valley about 5 miles from his property line. There, you see, Caldwell interrupted. The marshal admits the cattle were stolen. I'm not finished. Jed's tone carried enough authority to quiet the rancher. I found the cattle all right, but they weren't being held by Apache raiders. They were being guarded by 3 white men, including Tom Bradley, one of Mr. Caldwell's own hired hands. The revelation hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Voices erupted from every corner of the room as people tried to process what they'd just heard. Caldwell's face went white, then flushed red with rage. "That's a lie," he shouted. "A damned lie concocted to protect your Apache whore." The insult hit Jed like a physical blow, and he took a step toward Caldwell before forcing himself to stop. Losing his temper now would only confirm what half the room already suspected, that his judgment had been compromised by personal feelings. "Judge Harrison," Jed said instead, "I can produce witnesses who will testify to what I've said. Men who saw Bradley and the others with those cattlemen who heard them discussing their orders." "What witnesses?" Caldwell demanded. "More of your Apache friends, white men, trappers who were working the streams near that valley. They saw everything and are willing to testify under oath." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his weathered face thoughtful. "These are serious allegations, Marshal. You're suggesting that Mr. Caldwell orchestrated the theft of his own cattle. I'm suggesting that Mr. Caldwell needed an excuse to justify the actions he was planning against the Apache reservation. Stolen cattle provided that excuse." "Actions?" Mayor Walsh looked confused. "What actions?" Jed took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either vindicate him or destroy him. "Mr. Caldwell has been organizing a militia to attack the reservation. He planned to use the cattle theft as justification for a raid that would have resulted in the deaths of innocent people." The schoolhouse erupted in chaos. Men shouted accusations and denials, women gasped in shock, and children pressed closer to their parents' sides. Through it all, Caldwell stood like a statue, his face frozen in an expression of cold fury. "Enough!" Judge Harrison's voice cut through the bedlam like a knife. "Order! I'll have order in this room." Gradually the noise subsided, but the tension remained thick enough to cut. Judge Harrison waited until he had complete silence before speaking again. "Mr. Caldwell, how do you respond to these allegations?" Caldwell straightened his shoulders, drawing on every ounce of his considerable dignity. "Your Honor, I respond that they are the desperate lies of a man who has been compromised by his unnatural association with savage criminals. Marshal Stone has been harboring an Apache woman in his cabin for days, possibly weeks. His judgment has been corrupted by base desires that any decent man would be ashamed to admit." "That woman," Jed said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "was found beaten and left to die in the snow. She was the victim of Agent Marsh's interrogation, tortured in an attempt to force her to confess to crimes she didn't commit. I did my duty as a lawman and a human being by saving her life." "Your duty," Caldwell laughed harshly. "Your duty was to turn her over to proper authorities, not hide her away in your cabin like some frontier Romeo. The proper authorities." Nia spoke for the first time, her voice quiet, but carrying clearly through the hushed room, "were the ones who beat me near to death." A collective intake of breath greeted her words. Many in the crowd had never heard an Apache speak English, and the clear, educated cadence of her voice seemed to confuse their expectations. "Agent Marsh had me brought to his office," she continued, rising from her chair with fluid grace. "He accused my people of stealing cattle when I could not tell him where stolen cattle were because there were no stolen cattle. He had his men whip me. When that did not work, he said he would do worse. I escaped only because my grandmother created distraction." "Lies," Caldwell shouted. "The word of a savage against a federal agent." "Then let's hear from Agent Marsh himself," Judge Harrison said calmly. Marshal Stone, have you contacted the Indian agency about these allegations? I sent a rider to the territorial capital yesterday, Your Honor. Agent Marsh should be here within the week to answer questions about his methods. Caldwell's face went another shade paler. Clearly, he hadn't expected official involvement to reach that level. This is all irrelevant, he said, his voice strained. The fact remains that Apache raiders have been stealing cattle and terrorizing our community. The evidence speaks for itself. What evidence? Jed challenged. Your own cattle guarded by your own men, cut fence lines that could have been cut by anyone, or maybe you're talking about the other evidence you've been manufacturing. What other evidence? Tell them about the Apache artifacts you had Tom Bradley plant around the Hidden Valley, the moccasin prints he made in the mud near your fence line, the piece of calico cloth you tore from one of Nia's old dresses and left on a fence post. This time Caldwell's composure cracked completely. How could you possibly? You've been spying on me. I've been doing my job, something you should have thought about before you decided to frame an entire people for your own purposes. Judge Harrison was taking notes, now his pen scratching across paper with sharp, decisive strokes. Mr. Caldwell, these are extremely serious accusations. Do you have any evidence to support your claims about Apache raiders beyond the incidents involving your own cattle? There have been other thefts. Other ranchers have lost livestock. Name them. Caldwell looked around the room, desperately searching for support that was suddenly hard to find. Henry Morrison lost 3 head last month. Jim Peterson reported strange tracks on his property. I spoke to both men, Jed said. Morrison's cattle wandered off during a storm and were found 2 days later. Peterson's tracks turned out to be from his own horses. You're twisting everything. Caldwell was sweating now, despite the cold, making it sound like there's no threat when we all know better. The only threat to this community, Jed said quietly, was your plan to massacre innocent people based on lies you created yourself. Marshal Stone. The voice belonged to Reverend Matthews, who had been silent throughout the exchange. You speak of innocence, but how do we know this woman's people are truly innocent? How do we know they haven't been planning attacks of their own? It was a fair question, and Jed could see heads nodding throughout the room. These people lived with constant fear of Indian attacks, fed by newspaper stories and government propaganda. Their terror was real, even if it was largely unfounded. Because Nia said, standing again, we have children to feed and elders to care for. Because we know that any violence against white settlers will bring soldiers who will kill us all. Because we have learned that survival means accepting what we cannot change and protecting what little we have left. Her words carried a dignity and sadness that seemed to touch something in the crowd. Jed could see faces softening slightly, the rigid masks of hatred giving way to something approaching human understanding. Pretty words, Caldwell sneered, but we only have her word for it. How do we know she's not here as a spy, gathering information for future raids? Because, said a new voice from the back of the room, I can vouch for her character. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Mrs. Elizabeth Patterson, the seamstress, pushing her way through the crowd toward the front of the room. Her face was flushed with determination and something that might have been shame. Mrs. Patterson. Judge Harrison looked surprised. You know this woman? I knew her when she attended the mission school in Helena. She was one of my students in the sewing circle we organized for the Indian girls. The older woman's voice trembled slightly. She was kind, intelligent, and devoted to her grandmother. She wanted nothing more than to learn our ways and live in peace. That was years ago, Caldwell protested. People change, especially when they're filled with savage hatred for civilized society. The only hatred I've seen here tonight, Mrs. Patterson said firmly, is coming from you, Mr. Caldwell. This young woman has shown more grace and dignity in the past hour than you've managed in years. A murmur of agreement rippled through parts of the crowd, and Jed felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were reaching people. Furthermore, Mrs. Patterson continued, "I think we all owe Marshal Stone a debt of gratitude for preventing a terrible injustice. If Mr. Caldwell had succeeded in his plan, innocent blood would have been shed, and we would all bear the stain of that crime." Injustice, Caldwell's voice cracked with frustration. The injustice is having to live in fear while our marshal protects the very people who threaten us. No one is threatening you, Hiram. The voice belonged to old Pete Williams, one of the town's founding fathers. I've lived in this territory for 30 years, and I can count the actual Indian attacks on one hand. Most of the time we're fighting our own shadows. Easy words from an old man who doesn't have cattle to protect. I protected plenty in my time, but I never needed to manufacture enemies to feel important. The tide was turning. Jed could feel it. Caldwell's support was eroding as people began to see through his deception. But desperate men were dangerous men, and Jed could see the calculation in the rancher's eyes as he weighed his dwindling options. "Judge Harrison," Caldwell said, his voice taking on a formal tone, "I demand that you order the immediate arrest of this Apache woman and the marshal who has been harboring her. They are both criminals and should be treated as such." "On what charges?" Judge Harrison asked calmly. "Conspiracy, aiding and abetting known criminals, violation of federal treaty obligations." "Mr. Caldwell," the judge interrupted, "conspiracy requires evidence of actual crimes. From what I've heard tonight, the only crimes that have been committed appear to be fabricated by you. This is ridiculous. You're going to take the word of a savage and a corrupt marshal over a respected member of this community. I'm going to follow the evidence wherever it leads, and right now that evidence suggests that you've been manufacturing crises to justify vigilante action against peaceful Indians." Caldwell's face was purple with rage, now his careful composure completely shattered. "You're all fools. You're going to get yourselves killed because you're too weak to do what needs to be done." "What needs to be done," Judge Harrison said coldly, "is ensure that justice is served according to law, not according to prejudice and manufactured evidence." "Justice," Caldwell laughed bitterly. "There's no justice when white men are expected to kowtow to savage criminals and the marshals who protect them." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Jed could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Everything they had accomplished tonight could be undone if Caldwell managed to turn the crowd's emotions back toward hatred and fear. "Mr. Caldwell," Jed said quietly, "you're talking about murder. That's what your plan amounted to, the murder of innocent people based on lies you created. Is that really the kind of man you want to be? I want to be the kind of man who protects his own people." "So do I. But my people include everyone under my protection, regardless of the color of their skin." "Your people," Caldwell's voice dripped with contempt. "Your people are the white settlers who pay your salary and trust you to keep them safe, not some Apache squaw you've been rutting with in your cabin." The insult was calculated to provoke a violent response, and for a moment Jed's hand moved toward his gun, but before he could draw, Nia stepped between them. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This man speaks from fear and hatred, not truth. Do not let him drag you down to his level." She turned to face Caldwell directly, her dark eyes steady and unafraid. "You want to know what kind of woman I am. I am the kind who chooses forgiveness over revenge, peace over violence, truth over convenient lies. I am the kind who believes that good people exist in every race, just as evil people do. And I am the kind who will not let your hatred define either my people or yours." The schoolhouse was absolutely silent now, every person hanging on her words. When she continued, her voice carried the weight of centuries of suffering and the hope of possible redemption. "You speak of protection, Mr. Caldwell, but what you offer is not protection, it is the destruction of everything that makes us human. When we choose hatred over understanding, violence over justice, lies over truth, We become the very savages you claim to fear." "Pretty words," Caldwell said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "But words don't change the nature of things. You're still Apache, and Apaches are the enemy of civilized people." "Then I choose to be uncivilized," said Mrs. Patterson firmly. "If civilization means condoning murder based on lies, then I want no part of it." "Nor I," added Pete Williams. "Nor I," echoed Henry Garrett. One by one, voices rose throughout the schoolhouse as people declared their rejection of Caldwell's vision of civilization. Not everyone there were still hard faces and hostile stares scattered throughout the crowd, but enough to make it clear that the rancher had lost the battle for the community's soul. Judge Harrison waited for the voices to die down before speaking. "Mr. Caldwell, based on the testimony I've heard tonight, I'm ordering a full investigation into your allegations and your methods. Until that investigation is complete, you are forbidden from taking any vigilante action against the Apache Reservation or its inhabitants. You can't stop me. I have rights. You have the right to a fair trial, which you'll receive, but you don't have the right to commit murder based on fabricated evidence." Caldwell looked around the room, wildly searching for support that was no longer there. His men had backed away from him, their faces reflecting doubt and confusion. The community leaders who had once listened to his counsel now regarded him with suspicion. He was a man who had gambled everything on hatred and lost. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you've won something here tonight, but all you've done is sign your own death warrants. When the savages come for you, and they will come, remember that you chose them over your own kind." He turned and stalked toward the door, his remaining supporters trailing behind him like the remnants of a defeated army. As the door slammed behind them, the tension in the room seemed to deflate like a punctured balloon. Judge Harrison waited until the last of Caldwell's men had left before speaking again. "Marshal Stone, I want a full report on my desk within the week. Include everything: the cattle theft, the fabricated evidence, the torture allegations against Agent Marsh. Leave nothing out." "Yes, sir." "And Miss—" He paused, realizing he didn't know her full name. "Nia Yazzie, Your Honor." "Miss Yazzie, I want you to know that you have the full protection of this court. Anyone who attempts to harm you will answer to territorial law." "Thank you, Your Honor. That is more justice than I expected to find." As the crowd began to disperse, people filed past Jed and Nia with a mixture of emotions on their faces. Some still looked hostile or suspicious, but others nodded respectfully or offered quiet words of support. Mrs. Patterson stopped to squeeze Nia's hand, and Pete Williams clapped Jed on the shoulder. "You did good tonight, Marshal," the old man said. "Took courage to stand up like that. Just did my job. No, you did more than that. You did what was right even when it was hard. That's the mark of a true lawman." When the schoolhouse was finally empty except for themselves and Judge Harrison, Jed felt the full weight of exhaustion settle over him. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind the knowledge of how close they had come to disaster. "Well," Judge Harrison said, gathering his papers, "that was educational. I've seen lynch mobs with better manners than some of your citizens, Marshal. They're scared. Fear makes people do ugly things. Fear and ignorance, a dangerous combination." The judge looked at Nia thoughtfully. "You handled yourself well tonight, young lady. That took considerable courage." "Courage is all I have left, Your Honor. That and the hope that someday my children will live in a world where their worth is measured by their character rather than their bloodline." From your lips to God's ears. Judge Harrison tipped his hat and headed for the door. "Marshal, Miss Yazzie, good evening, and good luck." When they were alone, Jed and Nia stood in the flickering lamplight, both trying to process what had just happened. They had won against all odds, but the victory felt fragile and incomplete. "What happens now?" Nia asked. Now we try to build something better, starting with making sure Agent Marsh faces justice for what he did to you." "And Caldwell's finished." His credibility is destroyed. His support is gone. He might try something desperate, but he's essentially powerless now. Nia moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the exhaustion and relief warring in her dark eyes. And us, what happens to us? It was the question he'd been avoiding, the one that had no easy answers. In the heat of the confrontation, it had been easy to stand together against their enemies. But now, in the quiet aftermath, they had to face the reality of what they had become and what the future might hold. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I know what I want to happen, but wanting and having are different things." "What do you want?" "I want to wake up every morning for the rest of my life and see your face. I want to build something together, something that proves love is stronger than hatred. I want—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I want things that might not be possible." "Why not possible?" "Because I'm a white marshal and you're an Apache woman, and the world we live in doesn't have room for such things." Tonight, this room was full of white people who chose understanding over hatred. Maybe world bigger than we think. Maybe. He reached out and took her hands, marveling at how right they felt in his. "Are you willing to find out? Are you willing to take the risk? With you, yes, I take any risk. Even knowing it might not work, even knowing we'll face prejudice and hatred for the rest of our lives." Grandmother always say that love without risk is not really love, just comfortable arrangement. Nia smiled, and in that smile Jed saw all the future he could ever want. "Besides, we already face hatred. At least this way we face it together." He pulled her closer, then close enough to feel her warmth, close enough to believe that miracles were possible, even in the hardest places. "Together," he agreed. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the tracks and footprints that marked the night's events. But inside the schoolhouse, two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances held each other and planned for a future that would demand everything they had to give. The battle for Solitude Creek was over. The battle for their life together was just beginning. But they would face it as they had faced everything else, with courage, with determination, and with the unshakable belief that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. In the morning, there would be reports to write and wounds to heal. There would be investigations and testimonies and the slow work of building justice from the ruins of hatred. Agent Marsh would face questioning, Caldwell would face consequences, and the delicate work of peace would continue. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of shared victory and mutual trust, they had found something more precious than safety, more valuable than acceptance. They had found each other, and they had found home. The snow continued to fall, and somewhere in its whispered promise of renewal, the future waited to be written. The cabin felt different when they returned to it that night, transformed by everything that had passed between them and everything that lay ahead. What had once been a temporary shelter had become something more permanent, more sacred, a place where two people had chosen to build a life together despite all the reasons why they shouldn't. Jed stirred the fire back to life, while Nia moved around the small space with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. They didn't speak much at first, both still processing the magnitude of what had happened in the schoolhouse, both understanding that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. "You hungry?" Jed asked, though he wasn't sure he could eat anything himself. The confrontation had left him drained, every emotion wrung out, until he felt hollow as an empty barrel. "Little bit, but mostly tired." Nia settled into the chair by the fire, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. "Feel like I've been holding my breath for hours." "You can breathe now. We both can." "Can we, or is this just quiet before next storm?" It was a fair question, one that had been nagging at Jed since they'd left the schoolhouse. Caldwell might be discredited, but that didn't mean he was harmless. Desperate men did desperate things, and a man who'd built his reputation on being the protector of white interests wouldn't give up easily. "There'll be other storms," Jed admitted, "but we'll face them like we faced tonight together." Naya smiled at that, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since they'd started this whole ordeal. Together, I like sound of that word. They prepared a simple meal of beans and hardtack eating by firelight while the wind whistled around the cabin walls. Outside, the world was settling into the deep quiet that only came with heavy snowfall, the kind of silence that made everything inside seem more intimate, more precious. "Tell me about your grandmother," Jed said as they finished eating. "What will she think about this?" He gestured between them, meaning everything that had developed between them. Naya was quiet for a moment, considering. "Grandmother is wise woman. She understand that heart choose its own path, not always path that world approve of." She paused, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "But she also practical woman. She know that love between Apache woman and white man bring many troubles. And she say that troubles shared are troubles halved, but happiness shared is happiness doubled." Nia's voice grew softer. "She also say that sometimes Creator put people together not because it easy, but because they need each other to become who they meant to be. Do you believe that? I believe that you make me braver than I ever been. I believe that together we might be able to build bridge between two worlds that seem impossible to connect." She reached across the small table and took his hand. "I believe that some things worth any risk." Jed squeezed her hand, marveling again at how perfectly it fit in his. "What about your people? Will they accept me?" "Some will, some won't. Same as tonight in schoolhouse. Some white people choose understanding, others choose hatred. People are people, no matter what color their skin. And the practical things, where we'll live, how we'll make a living, what happens when I'm no longer Marshal. You think they remove you from job? Maybe, probably. Tonight bought us time, but territorial officials might decide I've compromised my position too much to be effective." Jed had been thinking about this all evening, running through scenarios in his mind. "Doesn't matter, though. I made my choice. What you do if they take badge, find other work. There's always need for men who know horses and aren't afraid of hard labor. Maybe we could start ranch somewhere, raise cattle and children, and try to prove that different kinds of people can build something good together." "Children." Naya repeated the word softly, as if testing how it sounded. "You want children? With you?" "Yeah, I'd like that very much." Color rose in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "What they be our children, not white, not Apache. Something in between. They'll be ours. That's all that matters. World might not see it that way. Then we'll teach them to be strong enough to face a world that doesn't understand them. We'll teach them that being different isn't being wrong, just being challenging." Jed's voice grew more certain as he spoke. "We'll raise them to be bridges between worlds, like their mother. Like their father, too. You are bridge also, Jed Stone. You choose to see past skin color to heart underneath." They talked long into the night, planning and dreaming and facing the practical realities of their situation. There would be paperwork to complete regarding the investigation into Caldwell's activities. There would be meetings with territorial officials who would want to understand how their marshal had become romantically involved with an Apache woman. There would be decisions to make about where they could live safely, how they could support themselves, whether they should stay in Montana territory or seek their fortune elsewhere. But beneath all the practical concerns was a deeper conversation, the kind that happened when two people decided to join their lives completely. They talked about their fears and hopes, their past mistakes and future dreams. They talked about the kind of home they wanted to create, the values they wanted to share, the legacy they wanted to leave. "I scared sometimes," Nia admitted as the fire burned low. "Not of danger from outside, but of not being enough, not knowing how to be what you need. You're everything I need. You're everything I never knew I was looking for. But I never been wife to anyone. I don't know white woman's ways, white woman's duties. I don't want a white woman's wife. I want you exactly as you are. Jed moved from his chair to kneel beside hers, taking both her hands in his. I want the woman who survived torture and walked through a blizzard rather than give up. I want the woman who faced down a room full of hostile strangers with nothing but truth and courage. I want the woman who taught me that love is worth any risk. Tears gathered in her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came with overwhelming relief and joy. You sure you want Apache woman who bring you nothing but trouble? You haven't brought me trouble. You've brought me home. Home isn't a place, Nia. It's a person. It's the place where you belong completely, where you can be exactly who you are without apology or explanation. He squeezed her hands gently. You're my home. She leaned forward then and kissed him soft and sweet and full of promise. It was their first real kiss, the first acknowledgement of what had been growing between them throughout their ordeal. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, both understanding that they had crossed another line. What happens now? She whispered. Now we figure out how to build a life together. Starting tomorrow, we begin the real work. And tonight we just be together. No planning, no worrying about tomorrow, just us. They arranged their bedding together for the first time with full understanding of what it meant. Not just shared warmth for survival, but the conscious choice to become partners in every sense. They moved carefully, reverently, both understanding the significance of the moment. Nia began, then stopped, color flooding her cheeks. Neither have I. Not like this. Not with someone who matters. I matter. You're the only thing that matters. They came together with the gentle awkwardness of people who cared more about tenderness than technique, more about connection than conquest. Outside, the wind continued to blow and the snow continued to fall, but inside their small sanctuary, two souls found the completion they had been seeking without even knowing they were searching. Afterward, they lay entwined in the firelight, talking softly about everything and nothing. Nia traced the scars on Jed's chest, souvenirs from his war years, while he combed his fingers through her long black hair. Tell me about the war, she said. What it really like, mostly boring if you can believe that. Long stretches of waiting and marching and being cold and hungry, broken up by short periods of absolute terror. Jed's voice was distant, remembering. The worst part wasn't the fighting, though. It was watching good men die for causes they didn't understand, watching boys become killers or corpses before they'd had a chance to become men. Is that when you learn that some fight's not worth fighting? Yeah, that's when I learned that the most important battles are the ones you choose for yourself, not the ones other people choose for you. Like tonight. Like choosing to save a wounded woman in the snow. Like choosing to love someone the world says you shouldn't love. Nia was quiet for a moment, her fingers still tracing patterns on his skin. In Apache tradition, when two people decide to make life together, they must each bring gift to union, something that represent what they offer to partnership. What would you bring? My grandmother's medicine bundle contains herbs and stones that have been in our family for generations. Represents connection to ancestors, to land, to spiritual wisdom. She looked up at him. What would you bring? Jed thought about it seriously. My father's watch. It's the only thing I have left from before the war, from when I still believed the world was basically good. Represents hope, I guess. The belief that time can heal wounds and that tomorrow can be better than today. Good gifts, both necessary for marriage that last. Is that what this is, a marriage? In my heart, yes. Laws of white world maybe say different, but in my heart, we already married, bound together by choice and love and shared suffering. Then I guess that makes you my wife, and you my husband. They spoke the words like vows, simple and profound, in the flickering firelight. No preacher, no legal documents, no witnesses, except the wind and snow and the spirits that Nia's people believed watched over all important moments. But it felt more real, more binding than any ceremony conducted in a church. Mrs. Jedediah Stone, Jed said, testing how it sounded. Nia Stone, she smiled. Sounds strange, but good strange. What will your people call you? Those who accept our marriage will call me by new name that honor both traditions. Those who don't, she shrugged. Those who don't accept will call me nothing because I will be dead to them. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Is price I willing to pay for happiness? She nestled closer to him. Besides, you also pay price. Some of your people never accept Apache wife. Their loss. They dozed fitfully as the night wore on, both too excited and emotionally drained to sleep deeply. Several times Jed woke to find Naya watching him in the firelight as if she were memorizing his face. Each time she would smile and touch his cheek gently before settling back into his arms. Near dawn, they were awakened by the sound of riders approaching the cabin. Jed was instantly alert, his hand reaching for the gun he kept beside the bed. Through the frost-covered window, he could see 3 figures on horseback, moving slowly through the deep snow. "Stay down," he whispered to Naya, pulling on his pants and boots. Could be Caldwell's men. But as the riders drew closer, Jed recognized the lead figure and relaxed slightly. It was Deputy Marshal Tom Crawford from the territorial capital, accompanied by 2 other men in official uniforms. "Marshal Stone," Crawford called out as he dismounted. "Need to speak with you." Jed opened the door, keeping his body positioned to block any view of the interior. "Tom, you're out early." "Been riding all night. Judge Harrison sent word about last night's meeting. Territorial governor wants a full report and he wants it fast. I'll have it ready by end of day." "That's not all." Crawford's face was grim. "Agent Marsh is dead." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. "What?" "Found him in his office yesterday morning. Single gunshot to the head. Looks like suicide, but there's some question about that." "Convenient timing." "That's what we thought, especially when we found evidence in his office suggesting he'd been embezzling Indian agency funds for months. Looks like your allegations about torture might have been just the tip of the iceberg." Jed processed this information quickly. Marsh's death, suicide, or murder eliminated the most important witness to Nia's torture, but it also lent credibility to their claims about corruption in the Indian agency. "There's more," Crawford continued. "Hiram Caldwell left town sometime during the night, took his most loyal men and disappeared. Word is, he's heading for California, but nobody knows for sure. Running away. Or regrouping. Man like Caldwell doesn't give up easy. He might be planning something from a distance." This was troubling news. As long as Caldwell remained free and bitter, he posed a potential threat, but at least his departure removed the immediate danger to Naya and the reservation. "I need to ask you straight, Jed," Crawford said, lowering his voice. "Is it true what they're saying about you and the Apache woman? There was no point in denying it now. Too many people had seen them together and the truth would come out eventually anyway." "It's true," Crawford whistled low. "That's going to complicate things with the territorial officials. They're not exactly progressive when it comes to racial mixing." "I know, but it doesn't change anything. I made my choice." "Hope it was worth it." It was. Crawford studied his face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, you're a grown man. Just be prepared for consequences. Governor's going to want to meet with you personally, probably ask some tough questions about your fitness to serve." "I understand. One more thing. There's talk of moving the Apache bands to a different reservation somewhere farther from white settlements. Might be safer for everyone involved." This was news that would affect Nia directly, and Jed felt his stomach clench with worry. If her people were relocated again, it would mean another traumatic uprooting, another severing of connections to the land. "When? Spring, most likely. Takes time to arrange these things." Crawford remounted his horse. "Get me that report, Jed. And be careful. You've made some powerful enemies and they won't forget easily." After the deputies left, Jed returned to the cabin to find Nia already dressed and preparing breakfast. She'd obviously heard most of the conversation and her face was troubled. "Marsh is dead," he said, without preamble. "I know, I heard." She was quiet for a moment, stirring coffee with unnecessary concentration. He was bad man, but I not wish death on him. Probably wasn't suicide. Somebody wanted him silenced before he could testify about the corruption, and now no witness to what he do to me. We'll work around that. There are other ways to prove what happened. Maybe, but Marsh's death, Caldwell's disappearance, it feel like storm clouds gathering again. Jed couldn't argue with that assessment. Just when they thought they'd won a victory, new complications were arising. The territorial governor summons the talk of relocating the Apache bands. Caldwell's mysterious departure, all of it suggested that their troubles were far from over. There's something else, he said. They're talking about moving your people to a different reservation. Naya's hands stilled on the coffee pot. Where, somewhere farther from white settlements, probably Arizona territory. Arizona. She spoke the word like a curse. Desert land, far from mountains, far from sacred places. She was quiet for a long moment. Grandmother will not survive another move. She too old, too tired. Maybe there's another way. Maybe you could stay here, live as my wife, rather than as a member of the tribe. And abandon my people when they need me most. Leave grandmother to die alone in strange place. Nia shook her head firmly. No, I cannot do that. Then we'll figure out something else. Maybe I can convince the territorial officials that relocation isn't necessary, that the current situation is stable. You think they listen to Marshal, who marry Apache woman? It was a good point. His credibility with territorial officials was already suspect, and his relationship with Naya would only make things worse. We'll see. First things first, I need to write that report and prepare for whatever the governor wants to discuss. They spent the morning working together on the official documentation of recent events. Naya's testimony about Marsh's torture would be crucial, even without the agent alive to confirm or deny it. Jed was careful to present the facts clearly and objectively, letting the evidence speak for itself. As they worked, they talked about their options and their fears. The future that had seemed so promising the night before now looked uncertain again, clouded by political complications and the reality of their situation. Whatever happens, Nia said as they finished the paperwork, we face it together, that not change. No, that doesn't change. Whatever else happens, we have each other. And love. Even if world try to take everything else, it cannot take love unless we let it. Then we don't let it. Then we don't let it. Outside, the sun was climbing toward its winter, zenith casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing. Inside the cabin, two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances, prepared to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The battle for Solitude Creek was over, but the war for their right to love each other was just beginning. And they would fight that war the same way they had fought everything else together, with courage and with the unshakable belief that some things were worth any sacrifice. The future was uncertain, but their commitment to each other was absolute. And sometimes, in a world as hard and unforgiving as theirs, absolute commitment was enough to move mountains, or at least enough to give them the strength to try.